Welcome to a journey through one of the most unsettling cases in Appalachian history. Today, we will delve into a mystery that has remained cloaked in shadows for more than a century. It is a story that questions everything we assume about marriage, family, and the secrets that can hide within the remote mountains of Virginia. Let us know where you are joining us from on this investigation. The year was 1870. The Civil War had concluded just 5 years prior, leaving profound wounds across the American South. Virginia, in particular, fought to rebuild from the conflict's ashes. In the Appalachian Mountains, life moved to its own rhythm, guided by the seasons, the toil of the land, and traditions tracing back to the earliest European settlers who made those misty heights their home. Virginia's Appalachian region existed as a separate world. Families dwelled on isolated homesteads, separated by miles of thick forest and deep valleys. Roads were poor, often mere trails through the woods that became impassable quagmires during heavy winter rains. Communication between communities was slow and arduous. News might take weeks to travel from one end of a county to the other. Within this context of isolation and reconstruction, the figure of Theodore Whitmore emerged, a man who would become central to one of the area's most perplexing local histories. Theodore owned an expansive mountain ranch inherited from his father, who had perished during the war. The property encompassed hundreds of acres of land, untouched forests, and a commanding 2-story colonial-style home with a wraparound porch. Theodore's nearest neighbors lived almost 6 miles away. It was a solitary existence, but not uncommon for that time and place. What grew striking, however, was the pattern that began to form in the following years. Theodore Whitmore married for the first time in 1866, just a year after returning from the war. His bride was Sarah McKinley, daughter of a farmer from a neighboring county. The wedding was celebrated at the local church, attended by a few dozen guests. Sarah moved into Theodore's mountain home. In the initial months, she was occasionally seen on visits to the nearest town, accompanied by her husband. But as time passed, these sightings grew increasingly rare. When asked about his wife's absence, Theodore explained that Sarah was in delicate health and preferred to remain at home, sheltered from the cold mountain air that troubled her fragile lungs. Then, in the winter of 1868, Theodore appeared in town dressed in black mourning clothes. "Sarah has passed," he announced solemnly. A sudden fever had taken her in a matter of days. Her body had already been laid to rest on the property in a small family cemetery, dating to his grandfather's era. Burying the deceased on private land was a common practice then, especially in rural areas where transporting a body to the nearest town could take days. Some were surprised by the haste of the burial, but no one openly challenged it. Death from sudden illness was frequent in those days before modern medical advances. Fever, pneumonia, tuberculosis. All could claim a life in days, and Theodore appeared genuinely shaken by the loss. What surprised everyone was the speed with which Theodore chose to remarry. Merely 6 months after Sarah's death, he announced his engagement to Margaret Dawson, a 22-year-old woman from a respectable family in another part of Appalachia. The wedding took place in the summer of 1869, again at the local church. Margaret was described by those who knew her as a cheerful and sociable young woman with an easy smile and lively spirit. Like Sarah before her, Margaret moved into Theodore's secluded mountain home. And like Sarah, her appearances in town grew progressively less frequent until they ceased entirely. When Margaret was no longer seen, Theodore offered various explanations. She was occupied with household duties. She was expecting a child and required rest. She was caring for ill relatives who had come to stay on the estate. The excuses changed, but the outcome remained the same. No one saw Margaret. Then, in early 1870, Theodore wore black once more. Margaret had died in childbirth, along with the baby. Once again, the burial had been swift in the farm's private cemetery. Once again, some whispered distrust in hushed tones, but nothing was done. A pattern was emerging, yet it was still too early for anyone to clearly connect the dots. Theodore was a wealthy, respectable man, a war veteran. His explanations were plausible for the time. Mortality among young women was high, especially in childbirth, and the estate's isolation made any story hard to verify. It was then that Theodore began courting his third prospective bride. And it was at this point that a peculiar detail started to draw attention, a detail that seemed insignificant at first, but would prove absolutely vital to understanding the true nature of events in that house, lost within the Virginia mountains. The third woman to enter Theodore Whitmore's life was Elizabeth Crawford, daughter of a cloth merchant who had prospered after the war. Elizabeth was 24 when she met Theodore at a church dance in the autumn of 1870. He courted her with generous gifts and carefully chosen words, promising a comfortable life removed from worldly cares. The engagement was announced in November of that year. Elizabeth's family was excited by the marriage prospect. Theodore was considered a good match, despite the tragedies he had endured. His wealth and social standing weighed heavily in his favor. But during the wedding preparations, something unusual occurred, something Elizabeth herself mentioned to her closest friends. While visiting Theodore's estate to see her future home, Elizabeth noticed something extraordinary. There was not a single mirror in the entire residence, not in the entry hall, not in the bedrooms, not even in the bathing room. Where one would typically expect to find mirrors on the walls, there were only empty spaces or paintings of somber mountain landscapes. When Elizabeth inquired about the missing mirrors, Theodore offered an explanation that sounded strange, yet not entirely absurd for the era. He said that after Margaret's death, his second wife, he had developed a profound superstition about mirrors. He believed mirrors could trap the souls of the deceased, preventing them from finding peace. Out of respect for his lost wives, he had removed all mirrors from the house and stored them in the attic. Elizabeth shared this information with her friends curiously, finding Theodore's belief odd but understandable for a man who had suffered such painful losses. At the time, superstitions regarding mirrors were relatively common. Many families covered their mirrors when someone died, adhering to folk traditions that linked mirrors to the realm of the dead. Theodore and Elizabeth's wedding took place in December 1870, a modest ceremony due to Theodore's recent bereavement. Elizabeth moved into the mountain house on a cold winter morning, her suitcases filled with dresses and hopes for the future. Her friends visited her once in the initial weeks, describing the house as large yet eerily quiet, with long hallways and locked rooms. After this first visit, Elizabeth vanished from social life completely. Months passed without anyone seeing her in town. Theodore would occasionally stop by to purchase supplies, always alone, always with the same explanation. Elizabeth was well. She simply preferred the tranquility of domestic life on the farm. But this time, something different happened. Elizabeth's mother, anxious over the lack of news from her daughter, decided to pay an unannounced visit to the estate in the spring of 1871. It was a difficult journey along muddy Appalachian roads, but a mother's concern outweighed any obstacle. When she arrived at the house, Theodore greeted her with icy courtesy. He explained that Elizabeth was resting, unwell, and could not receive visitors at that moment. Her mother insisted, but Theodore stood firm at the door, blocking entry. He promised Elizabeth would write a letter soon, once she felt better. With few options, Elizabeth's mother had to return home without seeing her daughter. The promised letter never came, and 3 weeks after that failed visit, Theodore appeared at the Crawford family home, in mourning for the third time. "Elizabeth has died," he announced wearily, "a sudden lung illness." The burial had already taken place in the farm's private cemetery beside Sarah and Margaret. This time, the reaction was different. Elizabeth's family was devastated, and deeply suspicious. Elizabeth's father, a strong-willed man, demanded to see his daughter's grave. Theodore permitted the visit, and the Crawford family traveled to the property. In the small cemetery, encircled by a rusty iron fence, they found 3 simple headstones: Sarah McKinley Whitmore, Margaret Dawson Whitmore, Elizabeth Crawford Whitmore. The dates of death were spaced too closely together. Lives ended too quickly. Elizabeth's father wished to exhume the body, but Theodore refused vehemently, calling it a desecration of the dead and a violation of Christian principles. At the time, exhumations were rare and typically required strong justification and approval from local authorities. With no concrete evidence of wrongdoing or witnesses to anything suspicious, county officials saw no reason to authorize such a procedure. Yet rumors began to spread through Appalachian communities like wildfire. 3 wives dead in less than 5 years, all young, all buried quickly on Theodore's secluded property. And that strange detail about the mirrors, which Elizabeth had mentioned to her friends, began to take on new significance in light of the successive deaths. Some began to speculate that Theodore was hiding something. Perhaps the women were not truly dead. Perhaps they were prisoners somewhere in that labyrinthine house. The mirrors might have been removed so they could not see their own reflections, could not sense the passage of time, could not maintain their sense of identity. These were theories without solid foundation, born from fear and the fertile imagination of isolated communities where macabre tales served as entertainment on long winter nights. Others believed in more mundane, yet equally disturbing explanations. Perhaps Theodore was simply an unlucky man cursed by loss, or perhaps he was dangerous in ways no one could prove. Living conditions in the mountains were harsh, and women did die young from various causes. But 3 in succession seemed beyond coincidence. What no one anticipated was that Theodore, seemingly unaffected by the rumors and growing suspicions, would begin courting a 4th woman just months after Elizabeth's death. Her name was Catherine Miller, and she was only 19 years old. Catherine Miller was the youngest daughter of a farming family that had settled in the lower valleys of the Virginia Appalachians decades earlier. Unlike Theodore's previous wives, Catherine came from humble beginnings. Her family worked rented land, growing tobacco and corn in unforgiving soil. The prospect of marrying a wealthy man like Theodore represented a dramatic change of fortune, not only for her, but for her entire family. Theodore met Catherine at a county fair in 1871, where she was selling preserves made by her mother. He approached with his polite and formal manner, bought several jars, and struck up a conversation. In the weeks that followed, Theodore visited the Miller family several times, always bringing modest but meaningful gifts for a family of limited means: fine fabrics, refined sugar, even a pair of leather boots for Catherine's father. Catherine's parents were aware of the rumors about Theodore and his deceased wives, but financial necessity outweighed caution. Moreover, Theodore presented convincing arguments. He explained the deaths as natural tragedies, consequences of life's fragility in the mountains, where doctors were scarce, and illnesses could kill in days. He showed death certificates signed by a traveling doctor who occasionally passed through the region. Everything seemed in order, at least on paper. The engagement was announced in December 1871. This time, however, something in the community shifted. A group of older women, friends of the previous wives' families, decided to act. They visited the Miller family and shared stories about Theodore that went beyond the known facts. They spoke of how Sarah had mentioned feeling constantly watched in the house before disappearing from social life. How Margaret had written a letter to her cousin saying some rooms in the house remained locked with no explanation from Theodore. How Elizabeth had commented on the missing mirrors and a feeling of unease she could not define. Catherine listened attentively to these stories, but her family was committed. Theodore had offered a generous dowry, a sum that would help the Millers purchase their own land. It was an opportunity they could not refuse. Catherine, for her part, seemed fascinated by Theodore in a way that worried the older women. She saw in him a sophisticated, cultured man who had traveled and read books she would never access. The danger, if it existed, seemed distant and abstract compared to the concrete reality of poverty. The wedding took place in January 1872, in a ceremony even more subdued than the previous ones. Only Catherine's immediate family attended, along with the local pastor, who officiated reluctantly. Theodore brought his fourth wife to their mountain home on a frosty morning, the carriage slowly climbing the uneven road as thick fog rendered everything around them indistinct and ghostly. In the first weeks after the wedding, Catherine wrote 2 letters to her mother. The first arrived 10 days after the wedding. In it, Catherine described the house as impressive but strange. She confirmed there were indeed no mirrors, and Theodore had repeated the same story about superstitions related to his dead wives. She mentioned the house had many rooms, some of which Theodore kept locked, saying they contained only old furniture and family belongings he had not yet had the courage to organize after his father's death. The second letter arrived 3 weeks later. The tone was different, more reserved. Catherine wrote that she was adjusting to farm life, that Theodore was an attentive though reserved husband, and that she spent her days tending the house under his guidance. She mentioned Theodore had established rules about the property. There were areas in the woods surrounding the house where she was not to walk alone for safety reasons. There was an old barn at the back of the property that was dilapidated and dangerous to enter. And there was the attic, which Theodore kept locked because the floorboards were rotten and could give way under someone's weight. After this second letter, silence fell. Weeks turned into months, with no news from Catherine. Her mother, Martha Miller, began sending letters to Theodore's estate, but never received a reply. When she finally secured transportation to visit her daughter in April 1872, she encountered the same cold reception Elizabeth's mother had faced. Theodore greeted her on the porch, refusing to allow her into the house. He explained that Catherine was experiencing a difficult adjustment period, that she was emotionally fragile, and had requested not to have visitors until she felt more settled. Martha insisted, argued, and even wept. But Theodore remained unmoved. He promised Catherine would write soon, once she felt better. Martha Miller returned home with a heavy heart and an indescribable sense of dread. She shared her worries with her husband, who suggested contacting the county sheriff. But what could they report? That Theodore refused a visit, that Catherine was not writing letters. That was not a crime. And Theodore was an influential man, a war veteran, and a landowner. The words of a poor farming family would carry little weight against his. It was then that Martha made a bold decision. She reached out to the other women in the community who had tried to warn Catherine before the wedding. Together, they resolved to do something unusual for the era, gather all the information they possessed about Theodore and his wives. They would document the strange patterns, the troubling coincidences, and present it all not only to the local sheriff, but also to a county judge known for his strict and impartial reputation. It took weeks to compile everything. They spoke with merchants who supplied Theodore and noticed he consistently purchased food and provisions in quantities that seemed insufficient for 2 people. They spoke with the traveling doctor who had signed the death certificates for the first 3 wives and discovered he had never examined the bodies, merely signing the documents based on Theodore's descriptions of their symptoms. They spoke with the pastor who had performed the weddings, who admitted to a growing unease about the situation, but was uncertain how to intervene. What these women were doing was extraordinary for 1872, at a time when women had few legal rights and even less influence in official matters. They were organizing a parallel investigation, driven by the instinct that something profoundly wrong was happening in that isolated mountain house. In June of 1872, they finally secured a hearing with Judge Harrison Blackwood, a 60-year-old man known for his sense of justice and his untarnished social standing. They presented everything they had uncovered: the pattern of deaths, the inconsistencies in the accounts, the forced isolation of the wives, the removed mirrors, the locked rooms, and Catherine's silence. Judge Harrison Blackwood listened to the women with increasing attention. He was a man who had seen much during his years in the Virginia judicial system, but the story unfolding before him touched on something that challenged his experience. There was no direct evidence of foul play, only an accumulation of circumstances that, taken together, formed a deeply disturbing picture. Blackwood requested time to review the death certificates the women had managed to copy. All 3 certificates were signed by the same traveling physician, Dr. Jonas Peden, a man who roamed the mountain counties offering his services where established doctors were scarce. The listed causes of death were generic: fever for Sarah, childbirth complications for Margaret, pneumonia for Elizabeth. Nothing that would raise immediate suspicion in an era when such conditions were common and often fatal. But Blackwood noticed something the women had not. The dates on the certificates revealed a specific temporal pattern. Each wife had died precisely between the 6th and 8th month after marriage. Not in the first month, when adjusting to a new life could be most stressful, nor years later, when chronic illnesses might manifest, but in a curiously consistent time frame, as if following a schedule. The judge ruled that an official investigation was warranted. He summoned the county sheriff, a man named Robert Hutchkins, who had served under Theodore during the war and maintained a relationship of respect and camaraderie with him. Hutchkins initially resisted the idea of investigating a fellow veteran, based on what he called the gossip of concerned women. But Blackwood, who held higher authority, insisted. In July of 1872, Sheriff Hutchkins and 2 deputies traveled to Theodore's mountain property. They arrived at noon under a blazing sun that made the surrounding landscape shimmer with heat. Theodore's house stood imposingly, its white paint peeling in spots, the windows shuttered despite the warm weather. Theodore greeted them on the porch with his usual courtesy, but there was tension in his shoulders and voice. When Hutchkins explained they were there to ask a few questions about Catherine and check on her well-being, Theodore initially tried the same strategy that had worked with the visiting mothers. He explained that Catherine was unwell, that she could not receive visitors, that she needed reassurance. But Hutchkins wasn't a desperate mother without legal power. He carried an order from Judge Blackwood authorizing entry to the property and a conversation with Catherine Miller Whitmore. Theodore realized he had no choice. With visible reluctance, he opened the door and allowed the men inside. The interior of the house was darker than expected on a summer day. The curtains were drawn in almost every room, creating a perpetual gloom. The air was still and heavy with a difficult-to-identify odor, something between mildew, dried herbs, and another underlying element neither man could name. The sheriff immediately noticed the absence of mirrors, confirming what the women had reported. Theodore led them through the house, showing them the living room, the library filled with dusty books, the kitchen where a single pot sat on the wood-burning stove. Everything was clean, but there was an abandoned quality to the rooms, as if they were not truly lived in, merely maintained in a semblance of use. When Hutchkins asked where Catherine was, Theodore hesitated for what seemed an eternity. Then he explained that she was resting in her upstairs room, that she had not been feeling well for a few days. The group climbed the wooden stairs, which creaked underfoot. The upstairs hallway had 5 doors, 3 of them closed. Theodore led them to the back door. He knocked softly and announced he had visitors. There was a long silence. Then a faint female voice replied that she did not want to see anyone. Hutchkins persisted, identifying himself as the sheriff and stating he just needed to check on her. More silence. Finally, the voice said they could enter. The room was even darker than the rest of the house. A single candle burned in a candlestick beside the bed, where a figure lay under heavy blankets despite the heat. Hutchkins approached and saw Catherine. She was pale, much thinner than her family had described, with deep circles under her eyes and messy hair strewn across the pillow. The sheriff asked how she was, if she needed medical help, if she was being well cared for. Catherine glanced at Theodore, who stood in the doorway watching before answering. Her voice was monotone as she said she was just tired, that Theodore was taking good care of her, that she did not need anything. But her eyes told a different story. There was something in them that Hutchkins could not quite decipher, a mixture of fear and resignation that made him deeply uncomfortable. One of the deputies, younger and less experienced than Hutchkins, asked a direct question. Why had she not written to her mother? Why had she not let her family visit? Catherine opened her mouth to answer, but Theodore gently interrupted, explaining that Catherine was experiencing a period of deep melancholy, a condition that sometimes afflicted young women, and that the doctor had recommended isolation and rest. Hutchkins wasn't convinced, but he also had no legal basis to do more. Catherine was alive in the house of her own free will as Theodore's lawful wife, and although she appeared ill, there were no visible signs of violence or forced confinement. He asked if Catherine would like to send a message to her family, and she, after another glance at Theodore, said she would write a letter soon. Before leaving, Hutchkins asked to see the rest of the house, including the locked rooms mentioned in the reports. Theodore was visibly uncomfortable with the request, but again, he could not refuse a legal authority. He explained that 2 of the rooms contained only furniture, covered with sheets and boxes of his family's belongings. The 3rd was his private office, where he kept important documents and valuable weapons. Theodore unlocked the doors one by one. The first 2 rooms were exactly as he described: covered antique furniture, stacked boxes, layers of dust indicating no one had been there for a long time. The office contained a desk, shelves of accounting books, and some antique weapons mounted on the wall. Nothing suspicious, at least not at first glance. Hutchkins then asked about the attic. Theodore said there was nothing there but old trunks, and that the floor was dangerous. The sheriff insisted on seeing it anyway. Theodore stood still for a long moment, something indefinable passing over his face. Then he agreed, but on the condition that only one person go up for safety reasons, and that he would accompany them to show which boards to avoid. Access to the attic was at the end of the 2nd-floor hallway, a retractable wooden ladder that creaked downward when Theodore pulled the cord that released it. The opening in the ceiling exhaled air even heavier than the rest of the house, laden with accumulated heat and the strange smell that permeated the entire residence, now intensified. Hutchkins decided to go up himself, leaving the deputies to wait below with Theodore. The climb was difficult. The steps creaked under the sheriff's weight, and he had to stoop as he entered the attic due to the low ceiling created by the sloping roof. Theodore followed behind him, carrying an oil lamp that cast dancing shadows across the exposed dark wood beams. The attic stretched the length of the house, a long, narrow space divided by the roof beams, creating distinct sections. Near the entrance, old trunks were stacked high and covered in cobwebs. Hutchkins could see old clothes, crockery wrapped in cloth, the usual accumulations of a family that had lived on this property for generations. Theodore pointed out the floorboards, which were visibly rotted in places, with holes where the wood had given way, revealing the darkness of the space between the 2nd-story ceiling and the attic floor. But it was as Hutchkins moved deeper into the attic that he saw something that made his heart race. Leaning against the far wall, partially covered by a dark cloth, were mirrors. Not 1 or 2, but at least a dozen of them. Mirrors of all sizes, from small hand mirrors to large, full-length mirrors in ornate frames. Some were facing the wall, others covered, but a few were exposed, reflecting the dim light from Theodore's lamp at odd angles. Hutchkins approached, stepping carefully on the sturdier boards. He asked Theodore about the mirrors, and the owner repeated his story about superstitions and respect for the dead. But there was something about the way Theodore held the lamp, the way he positioned himself between Hutchkins and the mirrors, that aroused the sheriff's trained suspicion. It was then that Hutchkins noticed something else. Behind the larger, partially hidden mirrors were chests, unlike those near the entrance. These were smaller, more ornate, the kind used to store valuable personal belongings. Hutchkins asked if he could examine them. Theodore quickly explained that they were simply boxes containing jewelry and documents belonging to his deceased wives, things he had kept out of respect but could not bring himself to open. The sheriff persisted. Theodore, visibly nervous now, said he did not have the keys with him, which were kept in his office. Hutchkins did not believe the excuse, but he also knew he was overstepping his authority. Judge Blackwood's order was to check on Catherine's well-being, not to search the entire property for evidence of unspecified crimes. Hutchkins decided he needed more authority before proceeding. He descended from the attic with Theodore close behind. The group left the house under the bright afternoon sun, and Hutchkins noticed that Theodore seemed relieved to see them go. Before leaving, the sheriff asked one last question: to see the private cemetery, where his first 3 wives were buried. Theodore led them down a path that wound through the property to a small space enclosed by a rusted iron fence. The 3 headstones were there, exactly as the Crawford family had described. Simple gray marble stones, engraved with names and dates. Sarah McKinley Whitmore, 1846 to 1868. Margaret Dawson Whitmore, 1847 to 1869. Elizabeth Crawford Whitmore, 1846 to 1871. Hutchkins surveyed the ground around the graves. The earth above them appeared disturbed in a manner consistent with recent burials, but there was nothing obviously suspicious. He asked if Theodore would object to an exhumation if the judge ordered it. Theodore turned pale and vehemently replied that he would, that it would be a violation of the sacredness of the dead, and that he would fight such an order with every legal remedy available. The drive back to town was marked by a tense silence. Hutchkins knew something was deeply wrong with that house. He could feel it in his bones, but he had no concrete evidence of foul play. Catherine was alive, though clearly unwell. The house was strange, but being strange was not illegal. Mirrors stored in the attic were unusual, but Theodore had offered an explanation that, while bizarre, was not impossible within the beliefs of the time. When Hutchkins reported his findings to Judge Blackwood, the judge became thoughtful. He summoned Dr. Jonas Peaton, the traveling physician who had signed the death certificates. Peaton arrived a week later, a tired-looking middle-aged man in worn clothes. Under questioning from the judge, he admitted something that would change the course of the investigation. Peaton confessed that he had never examined the bodies of Sarah, Margaret, or Elizabeth. Theodore had contacted him on each occasion, describing the symptoms and progression of the disease, and requested death certificates to avoid the bureaucracy of involving county officials. Peaton, always strapped for cash and trusting the word of a respected war veteran, had signed the documents based solely on Theodore's account. He now recognized that he had made a serious error, violating basic medical protocols, but at the time it had seemed like an innocent favor to a grieving man. This revelation was crucial. It meant there was no real medical confirmation that the 3 women had died from the listed causes. In fact, there was no independent confirmation that they were actually dead. This possibility, as unlikely as it seemed, opened up new lines of questioning. If the women were not dead, where were they? Prisoners somewhere on the property? Sold? Hidden? Judge Blackwood issued a new order, this time more comprehensive. It authorized not just a visit, but a complete search of Theodore Whitmore's property, including the exhumation of the 3 graves in the private cemetery. The order would be executed within 2 weeks, the time needed to gather the necessary resources and personnel for such an operation. But Theodore Whitmore never allowed this search to take place. 3 days before the scheduled date for the operation, on a foggy August morning in 1872, smoke was seen rising from the mountains where his property stood. When Sheriff Hutchkins and a group of men arrived on the scene hours later, they found Theodore's house engulfed in flames that had already consumed much of the structure. Local volunteer firefighters tried to control the fire, but the house was too isolated, and there was little water available. All they could do was watch as decades of history and secrets were reduced to ash and smoldering rubble. The wooden structure burned with a surprising intensity, as if it had been prepared for this moment. When the flames finally subsided at dusk, only the skeletal remains of the house were left, charred beams pointing skyward like accusing fingers. The heat had been so fierce that even the foundation stones were cracked and blackened. The smell of burning wood saturated the air, mixing with the mist descending from the mountains to create an eerie atmosphere that sent involuntary shivers down the spines of several men present. The question on everyone's mind was obvious. Where was Theodore? And where was Catherine? Hutchkins organized an immediate search of the surrounding area. Men with torches combed the nearby woods, calling out names and looking for any sign of life or escape. But the Appalachian Mountains are vast and full of places where someone could hide or become lost. The darkness and rugged terrain made a nighttime search almost futile. At dawn the next day, with enough light for a proper investigation, Hutchkins returned with a larger team. They began by examining the still smoldering ruins of the house. It was dangerous and uncomfortable work, with unstable beams threatening to collapse and pockets of heat still radiating from the ashes. Using shovels and hooks, the men started carefully sifting through the wreckage, searching for human remains that would indicate Theodore and Catherine had perished in the fire. It was a job that took days. The house had been large, with 2 stories and an attic, and now everything was collapsed into a compacted pile of charred wood, destroyed furniture, and objects melted beyond recognition by the extreme heat. They found the remains of an iron stove, twisted nails, fragments of crockery, the metal components of books whose pages had turned to ash, but they found no bodies. The absence of remains suggested 2 possibilities. Either Theodore and Catherine had escaped before the fire fully consumed the house, or the bodies had been so completely incinerated that nothing recognizable remained. The latter possibility seemed unlikely, as even very intense fires often leave bones or teeth, but it could not be completely ruled out. Hutchkins then turned his attention to the private cemetery. The 3 headstones remained untouched by the fire, which had focused on the main house. Judge Blackwood's exhumation order was still in effect, and now there was added urgency. If the women were indeed buried there, their remains could provide evidence about the true causes of death. If the graves were empty, it would confirm even darker suspicions about the fate of Theodore's wives. The exhumation began on the afternoon of the 3rd day after the fire. It was a solemn and disturbing process. Men with shovels carefully dug the earth over the grave of Sarah McKinley Whitmore, the first wife. The depth was adequate, about 6 feet by the standards of the time. But when they finally reached what should have been the coffin, they found something no one expected. There was no coffin. Instead, there was a crude, poorly constructed wooden box of the kind used to transport tools or supplies, not to bury a human being. And when they opened this box, they found not a body, but stones. Stones roughly the size and weight of a human body, wrapped in old cloth that had rotted with age and humidity. A shocked silence fell over the men present. The implications were obvious and terrifying. The grave was fake. Sarah McKinley Whitmore had never been buried there. So where was she? What had Theodore done to her? With renewed urgency, they moved to the second grave, that of Margaret Dawson Whitmore. They dug faster now, anxiety making their movements less careful, and they found exactly the same thing. A crude box containing stones wrapped in cloth, another false grave, another missing wife. The third grave, that of Elizabeth Crawford Whitmore, revealed the same macabre pattern. Stones replaced a body. 3 women who had supposedly died and been buried on the property were simply not there. 3 families who had wept over these headstones, believing their daughters rested there, had been cruelly deceived. The discovery of the fake graves transformed what had been an investigation into suspicious deaths into something far more sinister. It was no longer a question of determining whether Theodore had killed his wives, but of discovering what he had done with them. If they weren't dead and buried, where were they? Still alive somewhere? Killed and otherwise disposed of? Sold? Held prisoner in some secret location? Judge Blackwood issued an arrest warrant for Theodore Whitmore for fraud, forgery of death certificates, and suspicion of kidnapping. But Theodore had disappeared. An extensive search was organized, involving not only local authorities, but also deputies from neighboring counties. Posters describing Theodore were distributed throughout the Appalachian region of Virginia and adjacent states. The description circulated widely: a man of approximately 45, of average height, with dark hair beginning to gray, brown eyes, and an erect military posture, generally well-dressed and polite in speech, possibly accompanied by a young woman named Catherine, with blonde hair and a fragile appearance, considered extremely dangerous. As the search for Theodore continued, investigators began searching for records that might shed light on his past and motivations. What they uncovered was a story that made everything even more disconcerting. Theodore Whitmore was not who he claimed to be. The real Theodore Whitmore, son of the original owner of the mountain farm, had died during the Civil War in 1863 in a battle in Pennsylvania. There were military records confirming his death. So who was the man who had lived in that house for nearly 10 years, marrying successively women who then disappeared? How had he managed to assume the identity of a dead man and live undetected for so long? The truth was that in the confusion of the post-war years, with destroyed records and displaced populations, it was not impossible for someone to assume a new identity, especially in isolated rural areas where few people would have known the original Theodore. Investigators combed the rubble of the burned house with renewed interest, searching for any documents that might reveal the impostor's true identity. But the fire had been meticulous, destroying nearly everything of informational value. The few surviving fragments of paper were so damaged they were illegible. News of the fake graves spread across the Virginia mountains like a cold winter wind. Families who had known the missing wives were devastated by the revelation. Sarah McKinley's mother, already elderly and frail, fell gravely ill upon learning that she had spent years visiting an empty grave. Elizabeth Crawford's father, who had never fully recovered from the loss of his daughter, now faced the torture of not knowing whether she was alive or dead, and if alive, what horrors she might have experienced. Martha Miller, Catherine's mother, was the most vocal in her grief and anger. She organized meetings with the other families, forming a sort of informal committee dedicated to finding answers. These women and men began their own parallel investigation, speaking with everyone who had had any contact with the fake Theodore, gathering every scrap of information that could help piece together who he really was and what he had done to their daughters. It was through these efforts that the first significant clue emerged. A draper from a neighboring county remembered selling Theodore large quantities of black cloth over the years. Not cloth for clothing or curtains, but rolls and rolls of heavy material, the kind used to completely cover windows or line walls. The quantities were staggering, far beyond what would be needed for normal household use. Another merchant, this one specializing in hardware, reported that Theodore had purchased chains, padlocks, and locks in unusual quantities. He always paid in cash, always picked up the goods in person, and never requested delivery to the property. When questioned about their use, Theodore vaguely explained that he was making renovations and security improvements to the farm. These details began to paint an even more disturbing picture. The black cloth could have been used to line the locked rooms the wives had mentioned in their letters. The padlocks and chains suggested confinement. But all of this was still speculation, not concrete evidence. Then, 3 weeks after the fire, something extraordinary happened. A hunter working in the deep woods about 20 kilometers from Theodore's burned property found something disturbing. It was a small abandoned cabin tucked away in a remote valley where few ventured. The cabin was in ruins, but there were signs of recent use. Inside, he found chains fixed to the walls, an old stained mattress, and carved into the woodwork, barely visible in the dim light. Names: Sarah, Margaret, Elizabeth. The hunter rushed to report the discovery to Sheriff Hutchkins, who immediately organized an expedition to the site. What they found confirmed their worst fears. The cabin had been used as some sort of prison. The chains were strong enough to hold a person, but long enough to allow limited movement within the small space. There were scraps of old food, rusty cans, and a bucket that had presumably served sanitary purposes. But most disturbing were the carvings on the wood. Besides the names, there were tally marks, small lines grouped 5 by 5 like prisoners do to count the days. There were hundreds of them, suggesting someone had been held there for months. There were also fragmented words, difficult to decipher, but investigators managed to read a few. Help, mother, please, God. The discovery of the cabin raised more questions than it answered. If the women had been held there, for how long? Why would Theodore keep them prisoner instead of simply killing them? And most importantly, where were they now? The cabin had clearly been abandoned for at least a few weeks, possibly since before the fire. Intensive searches were conducted throughout the area surrounding the cabin. Sniffer dogs were brought in from another county, trained to find human remains. They scoured the woods for days, following trails that led nowhere, barking at spots where nothing was found. It was as if the earth had swallowed any evidence of what had truly happened there. During these searches, one of the volunteers found something that added another layer to the mystery. On a tree about 100 meters from the cabin, there were notches in the bark. They weren't natural, but clearly made by human hands. They formed arrows pointing in a specific direction deeper into the forest, toward the higher mountains. Someone had left markers, perhaps trying to create an escape route, or perhaps guiding someone to a specific destination. The investigators followed the arrows for miles, climbing increasingly steep and difficult terrain. The markings appeared at irregular intervals, sometimes on trees, sometimes on rocks. Whoever had made them knew the area well and was determined not to get lost. The trail eventually led them to a narrow canyon where a small stream ran over smooth rocks. There, the trail markers ended abruptly. There were no more arrows, no indication of where to go from there. The stream could have been used to mask footprints, a technique familiar to those who didn't want to be followed. If someone had walked along the stream, it would be impossible to determine whether they were heading uphill or down toward the lower valleys. The search continued for another 2 weeks, but without results. The Appalachian Mountains are vast and unforgiving, filled with hidden caves, deep ravines, and areas so densely forested they are virtually impenetrable. If Theodore knew the region well, and all the evidence suggested he did, he could have hidden anything there, and it would have taken years to find. Meanwhile, stories began to circulate among local communities. Some claimed to have seen a man matching Theodore's description in distant towns, always alone, always disappearing before he could be approached. Others reported hearing female screams in the forests at night, sounds that could have been wind in the trees or something much more sinister. Each report was investigated, but none led to any concrete findings. Judge Blackwood, frustrated by the lack of progress, made an unusual decision. He offered a substantial reward, $500, a fortune at the time, for any information leading to the capture of Theodore Whitmore or the discovery of the missing women's whereabouts. Posters advertising the reward were distributed not only in Virginia, but also in neighboring states, reaching as far north as Pennsylvania and as far south as North Carolina. The reward sparked a flood of reports, most of them untrue or completely fabricated by people desperate for cash, but some contained details that caught investigators' attention. A river trader who worked on the rivers that crisscrossed the Appalachians reported transporting a man and a woman, matching the descriptions of Theodore and Catherine about 2 weeks before the fire. The man had paid handsomely to have them taken downriver to more populated areas. The river trader's account brought new energy to the investigation. If Theodore and Catherine had indeed left the area before the fire, it suggested deliberate planning. Theodore had known that Judge Blackwood's authorized search was imminent and decided to flee, setting fire to the house to destroy evidence. But this raised a disturbing question. Was Catherine with him voluntarily, or was she just another prisoner being transported to a new place of confinement? Sheriff Hutchkins personally traveled to interview the river trader, a man named William Garrett, who operated a flatboat transporting goods and occasionally passengers along the rivers that wound through the mountains. Garrett had a good memory for faces and details, a necessary skill in his business, where knowing customers and routes was essential for survival. He described the couple he had transported in vivid detail. The man was polite but reserved, keeping the woman close to him, never leaving her alone for a moment. The woman seemed exhausted, spoke little, and had the distant look of someone who has endured terrible trials. Garrett noticed she was wearing long sleeves despite the August heat, and when the wind blew her sleeve up briefly, he glimpsed what appeared to be marks around her wrist, like scars left by handcuffs. At the time, Garrett hadn't thought much about it. He ferried all kinds of people across rivers and had learned not to ask unnecessary questions. But when he saw the posters weeks later, with the descriptions and the reward, he realized that this couple might be exactly who the authorities were looking for. He had dropped them off in a port town called Greystone, located where the river met a main road that connected several regions of Virginia. Hutchkins took the investigation to Greystone, a community larger than the mountain villages with a population of a few hundred. There, he finally managed to find more witnesses. A boarding house owner remembered the couple who had stayed one night, paid in advance, and left early in the morning. The man had inquired about transportation westward toward the flatter, more populated lands beyond the mountains. A stagecoach driver confirmed he had picked up a man and woman, matching their descriptions on his westbound route. They had disembarked in a town called Millbrook, about 50 miles from Greystone, where the stagecoach stopped before continuing its journey. This was approximately 4 weeks earlier, just days after the fire on Theodore's property. The trail was growing clearer, but also colder. Weeks had passed, and Theodore could now be anywhere. Hutchkins traveled to Millbrook and continued his investigation. The town was even larger, a trading hub where several roads intersected, making it a waypoint for travelers going in all directions. It was the perfect place to disappear into a crowd. In Millbrook, the trail went completely cold. No one remembered seeing the couple. With so many travelers passing through town daily, 2 extra people didn't attract attention. Theodore could have gone in any direction, could have changed his appearance, could have separated from Catherine, or could be keeping her hidden somewhere while establishing a new identity. Hutchkins spent 3 weeks in Millbrook and neighboring towns, showing descriptions, asking questions, and following every clue, no matter how small. But it was like trying to hold water in one's hands. The farther from the source, the more the trail dispersed. Eventually, he had to admit defeat and return to his home county, where other duties awaited his attention. Back in the mountains, life slowly began to return to normal, though the Whitmore case remained an open wound in the community's collective consciousness. The families of the missing women never found peace. Martha Miller visited the burned-out property regularly, walking among the rubble as if waiting for her daughter to emerge from some hidden place. Elizabeth's parents held out hope that she was still alive somewhere, perhaps with her memory lost, perhaps held against her will, but alive. It was during one of Martha's visits to the burned property, about 2 months after the fire, that she made an accidental but significant discovery. Walking around the back of the property, where the ruined barn Theodore had mentioned as dangerous stood, she noticed something strange on the ground. Recent rain had caused a small amount of erosion, revealing something that looked different from the surrounding earth. Martha began digging with her hands, then with a broken twig she found nearby. A few inches below the surface, she found fabric. She continued digging with renewed urgency and growing horror. The fabric was wrapped around something roughly the size of a human body. She stopped immediately and ran for help. When Hutchkins and his team arrived and carefully excavated the site, they discovered human remains. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition, but enough was still preserved to determine it was a young woman. The discovery was devastating. Finally, there was confirmation that at least one of the wives was not simply missing, but dead. The search around the barn intensified, using sticks to probe the ground. Looking for areas where the earth appeared disturbed, they found 2 more suspicious locations. Excavations revealed 2 more bodies, both young women. 3 bodies, 3 wives. Sarah, Margaret, and Elizabeth had finally been found, not in the carefully maintained cemetery with its false headstones, but buried unceremoniously behind a ruined barn. The bodies were exhumed with the utmost care and taken for examination. A doctor from a larger city was called in to try to determine the cause of death, but the decomposition made this extremely difficult. There were no obvious signs of trauma to the bones, nor any fractured skulls or ribs that would indicate violence. The doctor speculated the women could have died from poisoning, suffocation, or other causes that left no obvious marks on the remains. Fragments of fabric found with the bodies were identified by the families. A piece of a dress that Sarah's mother recognized as one she had sewn for her daughter. A silver brooch that had belonged to Margaret. A simple ring Elizabeth always wore, given to her by her grandmother. These objects confirmed the identities beyond reasonable doubt. The 3 women finally received proper burials, this time in real tombs in the local churchyard. The ceremonies were marked by profound grief, but also by a strange sense of partial closure. At least the families now knew the fate of their daughters, could mourn over graves that actually contained their remains, and could begin the long process of true mourning. But one question remained unanswered, tormenting everyone following the case. Where was Catherine? Her body wasn't with the others. She hadn't been buried behind the barn. The latest evidence placed her alive, traveling with Theodore weeks after the fire. Was she still alive? Was it possible Theodore was keeping her somewhere? Or was her fate different from the others, perhaps already discarded in some unknown location far away? The winter of 1872 descended upon the Appalachian Mountains with its usual severity. Snow blanketed the peaks, roads became impassable for weeks, and the investigation into Theodore Whitmore and Catherine's whereabouts entered a sort of forced hibernation. Judge Blackwood kept the reward active, and circulars were sent to authorities in distant states, but hopes of finding answers dwindled with each passing week. It was during this period of forced waiting that local scholars and those interested in the case began trying to understand not only what had happened, but why. Who really was the man who had posed as Theodore Whitmore? What motivated him to marry repeatedly, only to have his wives disappear? The fake graves suggested a plan devised from the beginning, not crimes of passion or accidents, but something premeditated and executed with cold, calculated precision. The issue of the mirrors removed from the house continued to intrigue everyone. Why would someone remove all the mirrors from a residence? Theodore's explanation of superstition had never sounded entirely convincing. Some people in the community began to develop their own theories. One idea that gained traction was that Theodore didn't want his victims to see their own reflections, to maintain a sense of identity, or to perceive the physical changes that confinement and possible abuse would cause. Others speculated that perhaps Theodore had some kind of mental disorder related to his own appearance. Perhaps he was hiding not only from his wives, but from himself, some aspect of his identity or past. The mirrors stored in the attic, covered and facing the wall, suggested a deeply problematic relationship with his own image. A local scholar following the case began researching Civil War military records, trying to figure out who the imposter might be. If the real Theodore Whitmore had died in 1863, then someone had assumed his identity shortly after the war. This person would have to know enough details about the Whitmore family to convince distant neighbors that he was legitimate. Perhaps he was a fellow regimental member of the real Theodore, someone who had heard stories about the mountain farm and decided to claim it after the war. The records were incomplete and often contradictory, a result of the chaos of the war years. But the scholar found something interesting. There was a man named James Harlow who had served in the same regiment as Theodore Whitmore. Harlow was of unknown origin, one of many who enlisted without leaving a clear trace of their past. The records showed that Harlow had been wounded in action and declared missing in the same battle where Theodore died. Missing in action didn't necessarily mean dead. It could mean Harlow had deserted, been captured, or simply wandered around confused after being wounded. And if he had known Theodore well enough, if he had heard stories about the isolated farm in the Virginia mountains, he might have decided to assume that identity rather than return to wherever he came from. It was just a theory, but it was the most plausible so far. Meanwhile, life continued in the mountains. The spring of 1873 brought a thaw, and with it, travelers returning to the roads. It was in April of that year that something extraordinary happened. A young woman appeared in a small town on the Virginia-Tennessee border, about 100 miles south of Theodore's burned-out property. She was in deplorable condition, emaciated to the point of malnutrition, her clothes torn and dirty, and her feet bare and bleeding. She stumbled into a church during a Sunday service, collapsing in the center aisle before she could say a word. The congregants carried her out, gave her food and water, and called the local doctor. When she finally managed to speak days later, after being cared for by a kind family, the first words she spoke were, "My name is Catherine Miller Whitmore." The news traveled quickly. A messenger was immediately dispatched to the county where the investigation into Theodore was centered. Sheriff Hutchins, who had almost given up hope of finding Catherine alive, organized an immediate trip to the town where she had appeared. Martha Miller, upon learning that her daughter was possibly alive, was so emotionally shaken that she required medical attention, but insisted on making the journey as soon as she was strong enough. When Hutchins arrived and saw the woman, there was no doubt it was Catherine. Though dramatically changed by the ordeal, emaciated, and with her hair cropped unevenly short, her eyes and facial features were unmistakable. She was alive. Against all odds, she had survived and escaped Theodore Whitmore. But Catherine was in no condition to tell her story immediately. The physical and psychological trauma was profound. She had terrible nightmares, woke screaming during the night, and refused to stay in rooms with locked doors or covered windows. The doctor examining her found scars around her wrists and ankles, consistent with prolonged handcuffing. There were other marks on her body that suggested months of confinement in deplorable conditions. It took weeks of gentle care and patience before Catherine began to speak about what had happened. And when she finally did, the account that emerged was so disturbing that some who heard it became physically ill. She spoke quietly, pausing frequently, looking into the distance as if seeing ghosts of memories she'd rather forget. Catherine said the first few months of their marriage had been relatively normal, though Theodore had always been controlling and observant. But gradually, he began to change. He set increasingly restrictive rules about where she could go in the house, who she could talk to when they occasionally went into town. After her mother tried to visit, Theodore became furious. He said Catherine had disrespected his authority by allowing her family to worry, that she needed to learn her proper place as a wife. It was then that the real confinement began. Theodore locked her in one of the second-floor bedrooms, the same one where Sheriff Hutchkins had seen her during the official visit. But what Hutchkins didn't know was that this room was just a front. There was another hidden place where Theodore truly kept his victims, a secret room in the attic, accessible only through a concealed door behind a bookshelf in the locked office. In that room, lined with the black cloth Theodore had purchased in bulk, Catherine spent months. There were no windows, no natural light, only absolute darkness. Theodore visited irregularly, bringing food and water, sometimes talking to her for hours about his strange and twisted philosophies on marriage and control. Other times, just standing there, silently observing. Catherine continued her story with a trembling voice, each word costing her visible effort. She described how Theodore had told her about the others, his previous wives. He never directly admitted to killing them, but he spoke of them as if they were failed experiments, women who had not understood what he called the true nature of marriage. He said Catherine would be different, that she would learn, that she would become the perfect wife he had always sought. The secret room in the attic wasn't the only place of confinement. Theodore also used the cabin in the woods, the one the hunter had discovered. He transported Catherine there occasionally, always at night, blindfolded throughout the journey so she couldn't memorize the route. There, chained to the wall, she would spend days or weeks before being taken back to the house. Theodore alternated between the two locations unpredictably, part of his method of psychological control, ensuring she never knew where she would be or what to expect. During these months, Catherine made the markings on the cabin wall that investigators found. She scratched the wood with a rusty nail she'd found on the ground, counting the days, writing down her family's names, maintaining some sense of reality amidst the darkness and isolation. It was her way of resisting what Theodore was trying to do, completely erase her former identity and rebuild it according to his own sick will. When Theodore learned of Judge Blackwood's impending search warrant, he panicked. Catherine noticed the change immediately. He became agitated, talking to himself, making quick decisions. It was then that he brought her back from the cabin to the house for the last time. She was in the secret attic room when she heard Theodore moving around the house below, dragging heavy objects, spilling something that smelled like kerosene. Theodore went up to the attic for the last time, unlocking the door to the secret room, and for the first time, Catherine saw something she'd never seen before in his eyes: uncertainty. He stared at her for a long moment as if making a decision. Then, surprisingly, he cut her chains with a tool and told her they needed to leave immediately. There was a window of opportunity, he explained, but they needed to move quickly before the authorities arrived. Catherine didn't understand why Theodore was freeing her, why he didn't just let her die in the fire he was clearly planning, but she didn't question it. She seized the opportunity. They descended from the attic, left the house, and Catherine saw for the last time the place that had been her prison. Theodore led her through the forest, using trails he knew intimately, moving with certainty even in the darkness of the night. They walked for hours until they reached the river where the river trader ferried them. Throughout the journey, Theodore kept Catherine close at hand, holding her arm tightly, whispering threats about what would happen if she tried to escape or attract attention. He told her he still had allies, people who would follow his orders, and that Catherine's family would pay the price if she betrayed him. In the days that followed, as they traveled farther and farther from the mountains, Catherine began to realize that Theodore was improvising, that he had no solid plan. He was used to meticulously controlling everything, but the forced escape had thrown him off balance. In Millbrook, where Sheriff Hutchkins had lost the trail, Theodore rented a room in a cheap inn on the outskirts of town. It was there, in that inn, that Catherine finally saw her chance. Theodore had drunk more than usual, trying to calm his nerves. When he finally fell asleep soundly, Catherine waited to make sure it was genuine. Then, with hands shaking with fear and adrenaline, she grabbed what little money she could find in his pockets, put on shoes that were too big for her feet, and slipped out the ground floor window. The escape was the beginning of a weeks-long journey of survival. Catherine distrusted local authorities, afraid that Theodore would carry out his threats or that no one would believe her story. She traveled hidden in wagons, walked back roads at night, and ate whatever she could beg or find. She was trying to reach her family, but disoriented and without resources, she ended up going the wrong direction, south instead of north, crossing into Tennessee before realizing her mistake when she finally collapsed in that church. She had walked miles beyond what her battered body could bear, driven only by the sheer will to survive and return home. And now, months after her nightmare began, she was finally safe, surrounded by people who believed in her and wanted to help her. Catherine's testimony provided authorities with crucial information they hadn't previously had. She described the secret room in the attic, explaining why investigators hadn't found it during their initial search. The door was so well disguised that its exact location would have been necessary to discover it, and the fire had destroyed everything before they could conduct a second, more thorough investigation. She confirmed that the other 3 women had been trapped in the same places and that she had found their belongings in the secret room, small personal items Theodore had kept as macabre trophies. As for the fate of Sarah, Margaret, and Elizabeth, Catherine could only speculate based on fragments of conversations she had overheard. Theodore never directly admitted to killing them, but he spoke of them in the past tense, about how they had been unable to accept their fate, how they had become troublesome and needed to be silenced. The words were carefully chosen, but the implication was clear and horrifying. With Catherine's testimony, additional warrants were issued for Theodore, now not just for fraud and kidnapping, but for 3 murders. The reward was increased to $1,000, an astronomical sum that attracted bounty hunters from several states. More detailed descriptions were circulated, including distinguishing marks Catherine had mentioned, such as a crescent-shaped scar on Theodore's left hand, the result of a war wound. But Theodore Whitmore, or James Harlow, or whatever his real name was, seemed to have completely disappeared. There were occasional reports over the next few years, possible sightings as far away as Missouri to the west and South Carolina to the east. Some were obvious cases of mistaken identity, people seeing what they wanted to see, lured by the reward. Others were more convincing, but always arrived too late with the suspect already gone by the time investigators arrived. Catherine, for her part, went through a long recovery process. With the love and support of her family, she slowly began to rebuild her life. She never remarried, the experience with Theodore having left deep scars. But she found purpose in helping other women, particularly those trapped in abusive marriages, using her own story as a warning about the dangers of ignoring signs of control and manipulation. The families of Sarah, Margaret, and Elizabeth were finally able to bury their daughters with the dignity they deserved. The false graves on the property were dismantled, the headstones removed and discarded as the lies they always were. New markers were placed in the churchyard, simple but honest, marking the final resting places of the 3 young women whose lives were stolen by a man whose true identity would never be fully known. The burned-out mountain estate remained abandoned. No one wanted to rebuild there, not after everything that had happened. Nature slowly reclaimed the space, trees growing among the rubble, vines covering the blackened stone foundations. Travelers passing through this region of the Appalachian Mountains spoke of the place in hushed tones, telling stories of the house of the 6 brides, though technically there had been only 4. The number grew with the retelling, as stories that become legends often do. Decades passed. The case was never officially closed, but it gradually faded from public attention as new events and tragedies replaced its place in community conversations and concerns. Catherine Miller lived to a ripe old age, passing away in 1923, carrying with her memories she never fully shared, details too heavy to put into words. Theodore Whitmore was never captured, never faced earthly justice for his horrific crimes. Today, more than a century and a half later, the story remains one of the most disturbing cases in the history of Appalachia and Virginia. Historians still debate the true identity of the man who posed as Theodore Whitmore, his motivations, and how many other victims there may have been who were never discovered. The removal of the mirrors remains one of the most enigmatic details, a symbol of how he attempted to control not only his victims' bodies, but also their very perceptions of identity and reality. The place where the house once stood can still be found by those determined enough to make the difficult journey through the mountains. The rubble has long since been absorbed into the earth, but the stone foundations remain circles of blackened stones, barely visible beneath decades of fallen leaves and plant growth. It is a silent place now, where only the wind in the trees breaks the stillness, an unwitting monument to the lives interrupted and the secrets the mountains hold in their deepest, darkest folds.